Good evening. This is Mae Brussell at KAZU-FM, Pacific Grove, California. It's broadcast number 579, January the 10th, 1983. We're having a crisis. It's a crisis for a radio station. The KAZU tower went down in the rainstorm 2 weeks ago, and a part of it was broken. They ordered a part. It hasn't come yet. It was supposed to be put up by January the 3rd. We continue the broadcast anyway because they go to other stations and out by subscription, so the local people will have to obtain or have obtained the past broadcast to keep up with this information. There's so much that we can't stop. We have to keep rolling every week to keep up with just the bare minimum. Now, I usually begin the broadcast by discussing what took place 1 year ago tonight, just to update some of the stories because the year goes so quickly. And the subjects that I talk about on the air are continuous subjects. They are stories that had a beginning a long time ago. They surface currently, and the news will keep reappearing for years to come on the topics that I share with you because they're not subjects that are just one-time issues that close. And those of you that listen regularly, and this is the 12th year of the broadcast, are familiar with that pattern of how news keeps reappearing. And that's what makes this project so interesting. I forgot last week to update what happened a year ago. That was January the 3rd, so I'm just going to take a moment and do this now. Broadcast number 526, if you don't have the tape or if you want it, January the 3rd, 1982, had to do with the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, George Meany, the CIA, how the AFL-CIO became the arm of the CIA and its links to organized crime syndicate and to breaking up legitimate work. And the reason for doing it that time a year ago was the solidarity, the trouble in Poland, the instigation of altercations with the Soviet Union, hoping to get a response for them to bring in the troops and possibly set the stage soon for World War III. The history of the AFL-CIO goes back to George Cabot Lodge, the multimillionaire in Boston, who helped the United States corporation set up what they considered the arm of the trade unions to keep the actual labor movement down and keep it in the control of a specific group of people. And I went into the Eugene Rostow connections and Thomas Kahn and their work for the LID, that was an organization, LID, League for Industrial Democracy, that became the branch of the CIA, putting down the legitimate workers' problems. This all came about starting in 1937 because the Soviet Union had, well, you know what the Soviet Union did in ways of taking over the government and the laborers having control of a lot of the production and doing away with the multinational corporations per se. The response to behavior in the Soviet Union started obviously in the most obvious date where they got instigated was 1937, where Brown, Mr. Irving Brown, allied himself with J. Lovestone, and they ousted militant leadership of the Auto Workers Union, United Auto Workers Union. Well, Henry Ford and General Motors were large supporters of Adolf Hitler and fascism and started rearming Germany after World War I to oppose the Soviet system. And Irving Brown and Mr. Lovestone became partners in this international interference with labor. And then during the war, they worked with the OSS. And then when the war was over, still the OSS was our branch of intelligence before the CIA was formed. They worked with the underworld, with the Corsican chief. His name is Pierre Ferri, Ferri Pisano, Pissani, Pisani. And then that was the beginning of the marriage of the labor unions with the Italian Corsican mafia group in order to keep labor down. And this is where Lucky Luciano was released from the prison. He was head of Murder Incorporated in New York City. Tom Dewey had prosecuted him. Tom Dewey released him to go to Italy. Mussolini had kept the mafia out while he was a dictator there. So as soon as Mussolini was out, the government, the United States government, sent Lucky Luciano to set up organizations to break labor unions all over the world. And in exchange, they would allow them to deal with heroin and cocaine, and that is the origin of the massive importation of narcotics into this country from all over the world, and the union of the mafia drug dealers with the labor OSS CIA, became CIA in 1945, 1947, officially, and the American government from then on had a policy of working together, of breaking the laborers and having them into control of the United States federal government. Now, 1 year ago, I was talking about solidarity, and right now in 1983, the Solidarity Union was over. It's through. There are labor unions, but the Soviet government has accused in this past year, in the past few months, of the Solidarity being nothing but a CIA front with interference in their government. They brought in Lech Walesa for 1 year. They wiretapped him talking against the Pope and his benefactors. They photographed him in compromising positions with women. He fell for the bait. Or maybe he was drugged to do it. I don't know. But Lech Walesa is through. He never was a leader. He was never the kind like Gandhi or Martin Luther King. He was a man put in by the intelligence system with not too much intelligence himself, and the charisma was built up through the major propaganda media. Walter Rostow, who was the advisor to Lyndon Johnson during the Vietnam War, began breaking up the Fur Workers Union in Massachusetts for the AFL a long time ago. Well, Solidarity is out. The Pope was accused in the last 2 weeks by the Soviet Union as instigating propaganda in all the countries behind the Iron Curtain, that he's a propagandist that works for the CIA in the United States. They have openly accused him of this. The Pope was refused a visit to Poland this last year, so there have been changes in what is going on in Poland, and certainly the countries, multiple, behind the Iron Curtain have all of this history, and they have crushed the Solidarity because it was nothing but a Central Intelligence Agency operation. Incidentally, the key man for the CIA, for linking Irving Brown to the CIA's International Organization Division, was Tom Braden. Pardon me, Tom Braden, Braden. He's now one of the top newsmen for Mr. Turner's CNN cable broadcasting, and Mr. Braden has a program where he interviews people, and he's called the man from the left. And Mr. Buchanan, who was a speechwriter for Richard Nixon, represents the right. So they try to say they have a balanced left-right discussion with public people in the middle. But Tom Braden was the head of the CIA. He was identified in the Saturday Evening Post. He boasted in 1967 of his International Organization Division, and he helped destabilize Chile for the Allende murder. The AFL-CIO was big there. Tom Braden works for CNN, the propaganda station, and portrays him as the left. It's also interesting that in the story of the Bulgarian connections and the KGB connections to shooting the Pope, which we're going to discuss at great length, I'm going to today, or if not next week, with you on that subject. CNN is the cable broadcasting system, again, that broke the story that was absolutely denied by Secretary of State George Shultz and by the Pope from the Vatican, of their discussion of the Bulgarian connections to the assassination attempt of the Pope. All of this is a big propaganda lie, just as was Solidarity, and we'll go into it point by point. But CNN, that covers Tom Braden on a daily salary, is also identified as the station who is playing up the propaganda of the Bulgarian connections. Now, that was a year ago last week. Just quickly, a year ago, this week, January the 10th, that was broadcast number 527, I was talking about the struggles in the White House of the upper echelon, and I began that in March, the night before Ronald Reagan was shot, when CIA Director Bush would have become President of the United States. One night before the shooting, I was talking about the battle of the White House warmongers, and then I updated a year ago tonight, and in that 1 year since we discussed it, Alexander Haig is out of the White House, of the State Department. He's on the board of MGM and the think tanks in Washington and the Heritage Foundation, and also in Princeton, but he's out of the position of Secretary of State. Walter Stessel is out as Deputy Director of the State Department under Alexander Haig. Mr. Richard Pipes is out. As of this week, another major propagandist that I'll go into with regard to the Bulgarian story, a warmonger against the Soviet Union. He's going on to Harvard considered one of our better educational institutions, to become head of the history department. I wonder when people spend that much money going to Harvard University and sending their children, if they really know the propagandists and the liars and the intelligence people that run the faculty, such as Henry Kissinger, who was a professor at Harvard for a long time, who was working with the Defense Department and the CIA simultaneously. Well, Richard Pipes is going back to Harvard. Richard Allen is out. He's going to be the ambassador to Bonn, but he's not head of the National Security Council. So Haig, Stessel, Pipe, and Allen, 4 of the 5 that I identified a year ago, are out. The one survivor is William Casey, and it's hard to get him out. Remember, he's linked to Robert Vesco and the Security Exchange at the time of the Watergate. Casey is locked in there for one particular reason. He is the epitome of the triangle of power: the Vatican, the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, the organized crime mafia connections with his Lucky Luciano, Tom Dewey, the World Syndicate and narcotics dealers. And he's the Vatican, the syndicate, and the intelligence community, because he, again, was one of these so-called freedom fighters that went in parachute down into the Battle of the Bulge, the Arnhem area, where General Patton and our friend Fritz Kramer and Henry Kissinger and Prince Bernhard, the world leaders, were all in that little geographical enclave that I keep talking about in that Battle of the Bulge area, that I think is the most important geographical area and time slot to affect our history for the future and what has happened to this country in the last 40 years. Casey was there with those people, as well as down in the Corsican area, bringing in the mafia when Mussolini was out, making the world safe, not for Mussolini, but for organized crime syndicates all over the world. So much for that. That was a year ago this week and a year ago last week. And also to update it, there was a meeting. Irving Brown of the AFL-CIO was in San Francisco December the 2nd to have a meeting, and he now has been identified, along with Lane Kirkland, as being a source of problem repression, having organizations in South Africa, El Salvador, Honduras. The hold of the AFL-CIO with people organized way back to keep control of the labor union in the hands of a group funded not only by Nazi Germany but fascists in this country. They are more visible and more people are aware of them, and certain people were demonstrating at Irving Brown, speaking in San Francisco, and there was a little more in the news this year than there was years before on the awareness of what these people are doing around the world. Now, last week I was updating the news of the year, some important stories, important things I learned during the year, and I was running down some significant deaths that I was able to cover on the program. This isn't all the important deaths of witnesses, but just I left off with August of '82, and I'm just going to run down the names of these people because I'm going to go back with details of the cases now. Even though we discussed them last year, they're still wide open. One was the murder of Calvin Simmons, the black musical conductor, in August of '82 up at Lake Placid. The murder of Godspede, the CIA agent in Iran. The arrangement of Khomeini with Hamilton Jordan to give the Shah an injection in Panama that would look like natural death, because remember, the Shah did die in Egypt a few months later. If he actually had that cancer at the time, why would they have to be making other arrangements? And the Grace Kelly story is still wide open. The shenanigans going on in Monaco with the mob, the Vatican, and I'll get back to that later. We also have to do more on Grace and 20th Century Fox. I have a story 2 months overdue for the National Examiner on 12 deaths associated with 20th Century Fox. I haven't had time to even catch up on those, but we'll do those soon. The Tylenol story is sitting very quietly. It's very significant. The G. Gordon Liddy explanation long before it happened, how the CIA had aspirin for aspirin roulette. Mr. Lewis has been arrested. Total silence in Chicago. Leanne Lewis is in Kansas, I guess, cleaning up their import-export connections to India and other countries. The Tylenol story continues in another form up here in San Jose. A woman took Anacin. The important thing is that she was taken to the hospital and it was diagnosed as a stroke. She still can't talk or be very verbal on the case, and the doctors gave it a stroke story, that she had a stroke. Then her husband began to sue Anacin for $1 million, and then the motive came in because he'd already divorced his wife once, remarried her, beat her. He was wanted on other charges of trying to run down members of the family in a car. The charges had been dropped. Who comes into the case but Melvin Belli? And he's the attorney for Jack Ruby. He was the attorney for Errol Flynn, for Mrs. Hermann Goering, the Nazi Hermann Goering. Melvin Belli works with the CIA. He jumped right into the Anderson case quickly. When Mr. Ball came in on the DeLorean case, I said, okay, that's a big case when you get Joseph Ball. When you get Melvin Belli in these cases, you have a big story with international and national connections. And when he gets into the Anderson story, we have to get into more of that. But the whole Tylenol thing is just sitting like a turd. And as I say, we'll get back to the 20th Century Fox. The Nazi Party in Oroville, with the connections to German Nazi Party and worldwide Nazi money, is more important than killing just Joe Hoover, and the plans to free Charles Manson that were intended were stopped when Hoover went to the police. I wrote an account of that in the National Examiner. It's a small part of that, but there's been more information on the Manson Oroville connections. I discussed William French Smith's Operation TikTok, the war on drugs, and how he blew, we did a program, part of the program, on how he blew 5 major drug investigations the same week that he said he was going to have this great war on drugs, and how William French Smith and Ronald Reagan and the entire White House clique are so involved in the drug syndicate in every single way that his announcing his war on drugs was a farce. And one of the items I mentioned, October 29th, was Operation TikTok, how the judge wouldn't allow 1,000 hours of tapes. Why not? Because it involved the CIA, the anti-Castro Cubans, the assassination teams we've been talking about on the air for quite a few years, and the same people involved, if you followed it chronologically, into the murder of John Kennedy in Dallas. Well, since that program that I did on William French Smith, Ricardo Monkey Morales was murdered. He was the primary witness for Operation TikTok. He was killed December 1982. One of the head anti-Castro Cuban assassins, worked for the CIA, blew up that airplane, the Cuban airline that he bragged about, where 76 were murdered. Since I accused William French Smith of covering up the drug assassination teams, their primary witness was shot in the head in Florida. When Kevin McCullough of the CIA was killed just before he was to testify against Edwin Wilson, immediately the intelligence community and the mass media said it was suicide, natural causes or suicide. But how many primary witnesses have to be off? And I just mention these because they keep going. And in December of 82, just the end of this year, Ricardo Monkey Morales shot in the head. I will update many of these murders, again, that I did have on the air, and again, I'm going into at great length, I hope very soon, the death of Leon Jaworski. And continuing in the news all the time are the Nugan Hand violences that I began putting on the air in 1980, October 80, with the first story, the London Times, 14 deaths linked to Nugan Hand. Well, if there were 14 then, there must be 400 now, but we wouldn't know who they were. They'll look like car accidents and drownings and falling off cliffs and suicides and dying in a forest from exposure. But the story broke with 14 deaths, and we'll keep those up. And also, at the end of the year, Colin Chapman died, the designer of racing cars, a well-known designer who was about to testify about the Swiss bank accounts of John DeLorean, the Lotus company that Chapman heads, and the secret Panamanian accounts that just before he died he said he didn't have anything to do with. I guess you get the point in doing a resume of a few of the deaths that I covered in 1982. They were primary witnesses to cases that should be investigated, that will be ongoing cases that don't die, and we have to keep using these names over and over until you become aware of the pattern that is taking place of when they're off, at the time they're off, when the investigations are about to appear, such as attorney Norman Gary at 20th Century Fox, when Marvin Davis is being investigated and his partner, Mr. Rich. There are ways to die. There is Tylenol that appears like a stroke. There are heart attacks that are not heart attacks, that are cyanide in medicine. There are wrong diagnosis. There are silent machine guns. The IRA came out just recently in their trial in New York, and I want to do the DeLorean IRA connections also. They sent illegal machine guns over to Ireland, and the IRA said, well, how do they know they work? And they said, we tested them in Central Park. I have articles on joggers that drop dead in parks, or the former ambassadors from Belgium and San Francisco found dead in a park. There is poison in food that Frank Turple talked on the air this year about heads falling in soup when they tasted their soup. The rats that eat your stomach while you're alive that Idi Amin used, tested by Mr. Frank Turple. And this last week, his wife was arrested for her work in working with Idi Amin. She's in the CIA also. There's injections in the stories that appear to be natural causes that'll make a person, former head of a government who represented the United States, was put in power by the United States. You inject him to make him look like natural causes. There are experts at plane crashes. Mr. William Morgan Hetrick, the long drug dealer with massive accounts in the Cayman Islands and elsewhere, who worked between Fort Lauderdale and Hollywood and up in California, right near the Reagan Ranch. Hetrick, when he was arrested with his narcotic supply for DeLorean to parlay his $20 million into a $60 million operation, he was described as a man who worked with Learjet Company. I have to go more into that story too, the Learjet, for you. Morgan was the expert witness at plane crashes. Now, it would be interesting to get some private investigator to find out what trials he testified at and see if those planes were sabotaged. We talked on the air about the cancer tests, giving cancer to people, Harvard doctors and the Rockefeller Institute giving cancer. So even stories of Mr. Sharon, they asked him at the time of the massacre, they had these Palestinians, what should we do with them? And he said, cut off their testicles. I don't know if they die of it, but it certainly isn't very comfortable. That's one of the, operations of Israel. The orders cut off the testicles. Also in the news were stories of poison umbrellas that opened. This was suggested in the case of a person from Bulgaria who was in London, and they acknowledged that fact. When John Kennedy was murdered, there was a man with an umbrella standing on the curb, and when the car passed the corner and just when Kennedy was shot, it was either a signal or there was some weapon possibly in the umbrella that came out. But again, this year, 1982, in December, the umbrella story. Also, poison darts, injections thrown to you through various instruments like the cameras. And then there's the coup de grace, the kind of killing that Miss Smith did to John Belushi. She just simply said, I gave him the coup de grace. I mixed these two elements, the cocaine and the heroin, and killed him off. She can't be really put in jail for that because her suppliers will link to that large international Hollywood connection that would bring in and develop the major personality people, the people, the persons you see on your TV screens, on your nightly news, in the various magazines, all those so-called beautiful people. So in 1982, in summary, you had the cameras that killed, the fake heart attacks, the fake strokes, the cyanide dished out, the cyanide aspirin, the silencers in machine guns, testing people in parks, dropping dead poison food, rats. I repeat this because these are the methods you read and accept. The news story, so-and-so died, apparent suicide, so-and-so died, apparent heart attack. It isn't that way at all. When you read who they were and what they were doing when they died, you get a total different picture. They were at the height of success. They were about to testify at a trial. They knew somebody that, if they testified, would affect changes in our society. And then there's the old-fashioned gunning down, like Mr. Maselli or Fiorina, the witnesses to the Raymond Donovan case, when he's linked to the Gambinos and the Genoveses, and as our Secretary of Labor from New Jersey, close to Helene Von Damme in the White House. When you don't have time for the subtle poisonings and injections, you just gun them down and put them in trunks and cars. That hasn't run out of style either. But you inject the coup de grace, you mix the drugs, and well-known rock musicians or so forth, you say, well, they had an overdose of drugs. Or Mr. Chapin, the rock musician, he died last year. He's just squashed between a truck and his little car on a freeway, just sandwiched in. There are a lot of ways to do it, and the important thing is that the examples that I'm citing here on the air are ones that the intelligence community has testified in their courts or in their grand jury hearings that they did specifically. I have a whole file, maybe 26 inches of a filing cabinet, one entire drawer, of ways to die. And these aren't out of fiction. These aren't things I made up. These are ways that the CIA has said that they perfected before congressional committees. These are ways they testified at trials. These are ways that came up at grand jury hearings, and they're in the major news media. What I simply do is take them, copy them, and put them into one file, whether it's Mr. Churchill talking about rats eating stomachs of live people or heads falling in soup, fixing up airplane crashes, etc., etc. So that is 1982 ways to die. Maybe in 1983 they will have perfected some new ones, they admitted. I'm sure they will. But if you get the umbrellas and the darts and the food and the rats and the airplane crashes and the strokes and the medicines, and you put it all together, and the gunning down and the mixture of drugs and the car crashes and so forth, it's hard to separate who is off. The most important thing I can say as we start 1983, or if you read your history books of the past, is look at the way they died, and today they're saying more apparent, so it isn't clear-cut. Then look at what they were doing, and if what they were doing was interesting or questionable or provocative, if they're 34 years old and were active in the anti-war movement and so forth, Vietnam veterans that came home drugged and so forth, save those articles, just put them in a pile, and at the end of the year, you can develop your own story about what is happening in this country. That concludes our summary, I think, of 1982, although I will be continuing on the air the stories that we've mentioned before as new information comes in about them. Now, just as the news media lies about the way people are killed, the way witnesses are killed, they lie about the economy, and that is treacherous also because it deludes us into a security that we're now learning we don't have. It deludes us into believing that sending a $300 billion debt to South America will be paid back. Even at his press conferences last week, the President of the United States had no solution. He was asked about the $300 billion loan to South America, and his answer was that if there was widespread default, there would be some very severe financial problems. Well, the $300 billion to South America is a fraction. There are debts to Poland, Romania, Europe, Asia, Southeast Asia, South Africa. The fact is that the United States banks have loaned out more money than they have in the banks, and there's no way of getting it back. And this is something you have to deal with and stop believing again in the tooth fairy. Now, 2 reports came out of Congress which are interesting. One, December 26, just before it was reported, December 26 in the Washington Post, just days before the men left to go home for the holidays and tired from the lobbying on the various bills at the end of Congress. The report was presented by Henry S. Roos of the Joint Economic Committee of Congress. It was a CIA study of the Soviet Union titled, "The Soviet Union is Not a Basket Case." That's an interesting title for the Washington Post, considering simultaneously the American economy was a basket case and the men had to stay over that same day to pass some bills so that there would be money to run the federal government simultaneously. Now, this report is a heavy report studied for the past, analyzing the past 30 years. It was given to Congress, and it said the gist of the report was that certainly Russia has major economic problems. They admit that they have economic problems, but they're nothing like what is explained to us by various persons in the administration. And they cited the chief propagandist for the Ronald Reagan administration, Richard Pipes, senior White House advisor on the Soviet Union, who I said is now going back to teach the people at Harvard, heaven help them. He said the Soviet Union is in the midst of an acute crisis of its governing system. He said the Soviet Union is going to collapse, and he told us that the Soviet economy is going to be brought down to its knees. The power of the West will alter the Soviet system to bring it to its knees. And this report says that there is no responsible person who believes this, that this is wrong. The president has a report now, 401-page report called USSR, Measures of Economic Growth and Development. And our professor from Harvard is nothing but an outright liar, an absolute liar. And also on the same page of the Washington Post, December 26, in a corner of the story on the lying of the Soviet economy, Turkish ex-diplomat dies in apparent suicide. See, there's one of those apparent suicides. In Santa Monica, California, a retired Turkish diplomat died after flinging himself over a 100-foot cliff. He was 48 years old. He had been thinking of suicide, they said, for 3 months, and he apparently jumped over the Palisades Park and was pronounced dead. His name was Ali Bolukbasi, Bolukbasi. I better give you his name because probably in the investigation of the Ajan case and the way he killed a publisher, a leftist publisher in Turkey, and was let out of the jail by the right-wing fact. Those right-wing people are now being investigated on the plot to shoot the Pope, not the Bulgarians, but the gray wolves from Frankfurt, Germany, and Bonn that we'll be getting into. This Turkish diplomat probably came to the United States, probably, as a reward for his Ajan Vatican connections. For whatever reason, he's a retired diplomat, only 48 years old, pretty young to retire, living out by the Pacific Palisades. There's a 100-foot cliff, and he's thrown over just at a time of the big propaganda push about the Bulgarians doing the assassination attempt on the Pope while the CIA is being charged with that particular murder try. We'll take a 1-minute break now while you turn your tape cassette over on the other side. This is Mae Brussell from KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California. This is the second side of broadcast number 579, January the 10th, 1983, side 2. One more comment on that CIA report that was given to the Congressional Joint Committee. The report also said, according to the San Francisco Examiner, this was another segment, January the 9th, in the paper this week, the Soviet Union, despite weaknesses in its economy, is highly self-sufficient and perhaps the world's most self-reliant industrialized nation. Now, this is a CIA report studying the Soviet Union from 1930 up to 1980. They said, in fact, we do not consider it an economic collapse or a sudden and sustained decline in the gross national product. Analysts in the West typically have focused on Soviet economic problems. One of the worst things we can do is to underestimate the economic strength of our principal adversary, Senator Proxmire said. The import that we threaten the Soviet Union to cut off imports, they said the imports help ease critical shortages and spur technological progress and generally improve Soviet economic performance. But a cutoff of imports would threaten the Soviet economy less than it would any other industrialized nation in the world. They have 270 million people, a labor force of 147 million. By world standards, they are well-trained. They are all well-trained. They are all well-educated. The Soviet Union has a tremendous accumulation of capital assets. Much of it is worn out and technologically obsolete. But despite the large-scale expansion in some of their agricultural imports, they're basically self-sufficient with respect to food. And this article says that the idea of a sudden decline in their gross national product isn't even a remote possibility. Now, this is out by the Central Intelligence Agency, violently anti-Soviet for years, simultaneous with reports of the entire bankruptcy of the industrial world, the industrialized nations. And if you're going to compete with a social system, if it's capitalism, competing against communism, you have to offer at least what they have or better. When you swing to fascism, eventually with the mass education, television, tape cassettes, the workers are not anxious to support fascism any longer, and there is a large movement of awareness. This is why our Western allies turned against the President of the United States and decided to trade and deal with the Soviet Union with the gas pipeline. Now, last week at the press conference, Ronald Reagan was asked about the economy, the debt of foreign nations, and one question alone, they said, there's a $300 billion in Latin America alone that is owed to us. What steps will the administration take with such a problem? And our president, who isn't the world's best economist, if you haven't figured it out yet, said, well, of course there's a risk. I think it's a touchy financial situation. The recession is worldwide, And he said the Latin American countries are engaging in austerity programs. They've been starved for years, and also we are loaning out money more than we have in our banks. He said if the debts aren't paid, there's a very severe financial problem, and there's no indication they can pay the debts. So what the president is saying is that there's a severe financial problem at the time when the intelligence community is telling him that our adversary, the Soviet Union, is really fully employed with no debts. Do you think the Soviet Union loans out that kind of money to Brazil and Argentina and loans out more money than they have in their banks? Do you really believe that the Soviet Union is doing such a thing? At the same press conference, Ronald Reagan mistook a military budget of $21 billion. He got caught giving the wrong statement on the weapon systems and was off only $21 billion. Incidentally, the almanac for this year, January the 7th, a long time ago in 1931, President Hoover had an emergency committee and unemployment relief. There was 4 to 5 million Americans were out of work, and just this January the 7th, 1983, 1982 unemployment. Of course, there's more people now than there were, but the unemployment rate hits, is 10.8%. But construction workers, it's 22%. Teenagers, it's 24.5%. Blacks, 20%. Hispanics, 15%. Blue-collar workers, 16%, the unemployment. So we are trying to, through propaganda, to build up our system while not building up the system and going into debt with the weapons. And even as of this morning, the president is asking more money for weapons. It is total insanity. Now, without any interruption on other diversionary subjects, no matter what happens in the news, for the next few weeks, I'm going into a tangled area very slowly because it is it reaches to the fragments of our society that I've been discussing 12 years. I'm going into the Vatican, the assassination attempt on the Pope that I analyzed in May of 1981, compare it with the evidence coming out now. So again, you have a view here of what we discuss on these programs, and I'm going into the John Lehman family, Secretary of the Navy. We had amazing secretaries of the Navy, from James Forrestal, who was also in the Defense Department, with his work with Admiral Byrd, and then Forrestal is killed at Bethesda Hospital as one of the first experimentations on ways to die. John Conley from Texas, with his links to Michael Sindona and the Vatican scandals and the John Kennedy assassination he covered. There was Fred Korth, Secretary of the Navy, tied into General Dynamics and TFX. Mr. Korth was the attorney for Mr. Ekdahl, Marguerite Oswald's husband. The stepfather of Lee Harvey Oswald, the Secretary of the Navy, was the attorney for him. I'm going into John Warner, Secretary of the Navy, and the Lehman family, because they are caught. John Lehman, as a Secretary of the Navy, is caught in the news with that Abington Corporation. He represents Boeing and Northrop, where they get a $40 billion contract for airplanes that are defective. It's a parallel to the 1962 contracts that were given to Fred Korth, Secretary of the Navy, and the General Dynamics Corporation down in the Dallas-Fort Worth area as against Boeing. We're giving contracts to defective equipment, price overrun, overcost, political appointments, things that we don't need. Well, the Social Security and the other problems in our country are mounting, and the economic collapse is on the brink. $40 million alone, contracts to Northrop and Boeing by the John Lehman, whose family, one brother Lehman worked with Henry Kissinger, one works for Senator John Warner, next door neighbor to Edwin Wilson, and that whole Secretary of the Navy combine. Another one works as a propagandist for the Vatican, trying to put down the Catholic bishops at this time, and the Soviet Union has accused them of using this assassination attempt to hide the real role of the CIA in the assassination attempt of the Pope. The John Lehman family as propagandists with John Warner, Henry Kissinger, the Navy Department with Northrop and Boeing and the Vatican, and he's the first cousin of Princess Grace of Monaco, the Philadelphia Samuel Cummings, Senator John Tower ball of wax. I'm going to go into what is happening in the Vatican, specifically the assassination attempt on the Pope, the charges that are going back and forth, and I'm going to put them in, not going fast, in the most simple form this week and next week so that you have a background for all time, because what is happening here is, again, a parallel. We have two parallels going on simultaneously. One with the contracts of the John Lehman organization and his wife, which is a CIA dummy front of, the Vatican Opus Dei connections, giving contracts with our tax dollars for products that are not even workable. We have the parallel of the General Dynamics and the Fort Worth, Dallas, exposés of that during the Vietnam War and how the plane really functioned. Then we have a parallel between the murder of John Kennedy and the assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II. Lee Harvey Oswald worked with Navy intelligence, and we'll go into these people with the same Nugan-Hand, Mr. Pipes and Richard Pipes, and with Mr. Paisley and the Task Force 157. Oswald worked in the Soviet Union in Navy intelligence, but before he came home, before the decision to murder John Kennedy, it was made in 1960, before the decision was made on how to murder him, simultaneously they were working the cover. So after he's through with all of his assignments in the Pacific, in radio work, electronics work, the U-2 bases, in the Philippines and in Japan, he is sent home with a Russian wife that everyone assumes, if you're Russian, you're communist, just like if you assume you're a Bulgarian, you're KGB. Marina was a white Russian, Zara's family from Minsk, associated with the Reinhard Gehlen operation, the Otto von Bolshevik Nazis, came to the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Now, they gave Oswald an assignment. Go to New Orleans and hand out handbills in front of the trademark Freight Cuba Committee. Then they sent him to Mexico, and it wasn't even him at all, but he did take a trip to Mexico. It wasn't him at the Mexican embassy, the Cuban embassy in Mexico City. They gave him a pro-Castro cover in New Orleans and in Mexico, even though everyone Oswald worked with in Dallas, first Fort Worth, then Dallas, and then New Orleans, and in Southeast in Asia when he was in the Marines, but when he came home was right-wing military intelligence, NASA, people employed by NASA. Oswald was a CIA man with paths to anti-Castro Cubans. They had a double, somebody that emulated him, that went around using the pro-Castro cover, so that it would look like Castro wanted to kill John Kennedy. And when the House Select Committee opened up again their research, 1976, 77, on who killed John Kennedy, and they had only a few $1 million to do the work, 1/3 of it was spent on did Fidel Castro do it. So we will see budgets and money and propaganda on the Bulgarian KGB Andropov attempt to shoot the Pope. So if you separate the real Oswald from who we saw, who got him his job, his security clearances, his passports, his training, from the propaganda of Castro tried to do it, and you separate the Bulgarian story of the KGB wanted to shoot the Pope, the great Antichrist because of the labor unions in Poland, when you separate that, you have the massive propaganda going on at this time on the Bulgarian connections, and I mean massive, and then you, as we did with the John Kennedy, with the Castro connection. So that's why it's important to do an overlay now analytically on these stories. Now, one item that I do want to mention, and then we'll swing right to the Vatican. In July of 1981, that was a year and a half ago, broadcast number 500, I was talking about treason and terror for the purpose of total fascism. And I had a list of names in that broadcast that's on the printed sheet. If you don't have that broadcast, that is very up to date now, as are most of these programs. I hope they always will be. But I said, what do these names have in common with Alexander Haig's terrorist mentality? Because he was Secretary of State, and of course he still is very important in this echelon of corporations and influencing space stations, United Technology, and the future space operations, and his contacts with Hollywood now, and interlocking boards that he and Gerald Ford and Henry Kissinger are on. And I listed names like Theodore Shackley, Edwin Wilson, Frank Nugan, Michael Hand, Frank Turple, Kevin McCulloughy, Richard Helms, the Bay of Pigs, George Corcola, George Bush, Vernon Walters, William Casey, William Colby, Alexander Haig, John Conley, Michael Sindona, John Hinckley Jr., Muhammad Ali Ajah, Mark David Chapman, who shot John Lennon, the Wells Fargo Bank in California, the Green Berets, and Vernon Walters. Now, those names are very significant because they interweave into these stories today. Vernon Walters was a gentleman in October that went to see the Pope, who tried to stop the priests from the anti-nuclear movement. And the Soviet Union is charging the CIA right now for the reason of blaming the Bulgarian story is because the priests in the fall of this year brought in the anti-nuclear movement and the wish for peace in the world. And they're accusing Vernon Walters of his trip there and also the John Lehman family, the Secretary of Navy, coming down on the priests. Now, will it work? No, it's not going to work. But these names, the Green Berets, have been hired for the security of the Olympic Games in Los Angeles, and I gave you the background a few weeks ago of how it was formed by Hitler's chief of intelligence and the top Nazi killers that set out in Germany and then moved to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Now, those names are important, and I can pull them into almost every story I do and current articles today, but this was in 1981 in July, a year and a half ago, that I was telling you about these names because I'll use them in current stories, but I want you to try and remember them, and I'll put them again on a printed sheet that accompanies the tapes to this broadcast. Now, one major story to get right into along these lines, the Pope named 18 cardinals this last week. I'm sure most of you read that. And, of course, the front page story of the New York Times, an American is passed over. Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, the American whose elevation seemed probable last year, was not named. Paul Marcinkus from Cicero, Illinois, right out of the old Al Capone neighborhood, in charge of the Bank of the Vatican. He still can't leave the Vatican. The Pope must get awfully bored with him. I wonder if they eat dinner together, if they even talk to each other. Marcinkus would be arrested if he set foot outside the Vatican, so he's sort of locked in his prison. And maybe it's like Sartre's No Exit. They have to live together until the end. Maybe Marcinkus will die of an apparent heart attack or one of the poisons they fed Pope Paul I. I don't know what they're going to do with Marcinkus. Now, the Pope did elevate Hermann in charge of the Vatican Bank. Many of you might have read this last week, the confrontation of the Holocaust Center down in Los Angeles, charging the Vatican with using Hitler's head of the Reich Bank to be in the Vatican financial circles. Again, he's 82 years old. Charles Hyam, who wrote Trading with the Enemy, was up here in Carmel. In November, I discussed his new book. I also mentioned Hermann Abst as being part of the Reich Bank and being appointed by the Vatican. And Charles Hyam had tapes of these broadcasts of that particular subject. He's out touring the country with his new book right now. He had those tapes, and he went immediately to the Holocaust Center and had press conferences. It was mentioned in the Washington Post as instigating an investigation into why the Vatican is using Hitler's financier to handle their finances, that full cycle which we analyzed on these programs, how the Polish Pope worked at Auschwitz, worked for I.G. Farben. Mr. Hermann Abst was on the board of I.G. Farben, making the chemicals to exterminate over 6 million. Well, there were more than 6 million Jews alone, but more than 6 million died as a result of the I.G. Farben chemicals and extermination program. When Charles Hyman called me about it, he said, "Did you hear about the press conference? Did you hear about it?" That was material that I called attention to news media people from the minute I saw it in the Washington Post, New York Times, Hermann Abst appointment. It was on the cover of the New York Times, as a matter of fact. And then Hyam went down to the Holocaust. He was living in L.A. He still does, but he's traveling. Went to the Holocaust Center with the information. I said, why don't you simultaneously tell them that what I've been trying to say to Rabbi Weir down there for 2 years about the I.G. Farben Pope from Auschwitz? Why hasn't that story broken yet? Someday it will, but the minute the Pope what became the Pope and the other one was poisoned, I began the investigation of this Pope, his background, and who he worked for. But at least it's coming out. Now, Abst was promoted, getting back to that. But Marcinkus, if the Pope had made him a cardinal at this time, it would have said, I don't give a damn about anyone in the world. I don't care about you. The hell with it. This is what I'm going to do, and make Marcinkus elevated to a cardinal. But he didn't, and I hope the pressure is on that he never did. He made cardinals behind the Iron Curtain. That is true. But then he made another step, and this is a step forward in terms of these forces of evil confronting persons, facing them eyeball to eyeball, and backing down. The Pope backed down for making Marcinkus a cardinal. That is a very important step. The next thing he did was he made Joseph Bernardine a cardinal. Now that is another step to anger Ronald Reagan and Vernon Walters and the Pentagon, Mr. Pipes and those people I've been talking about. There are articles in the newspaper that the Soviet Union had said instigated this confrontation of trying to blame the Soviet Union for the shooting attempt on the Pope. I can't share all of those with you, but there are many articles, even in the Washington Times, which is run by Reverend Moon, an article divesting the peace bishops of their moral luxury. And this article is about the Catholic bishops on a cloud called pacifism. And they're saying below, we're just opposed to mushroom-shaped clouds. And they're trying to force these people to change their tune about the anti-nuclear, that they have to give up the luxury of the nuclear deterrence. The world has had 37 years of nuclear peace, and they're worried about a whole nuclear holocaust where almost all the people on the planet Earth will be killed by nuclear bombs. And the Pope has elevated Mr. Bernardine, who is behind the nuclear opposition right now. Another story from the Washington Times. I love reading the Reverend Moon newspaper back there. The bishops get a letter saying they're making a mistake. This is a half-page story by Lieutenant General Daniel Graham, proponent of the high frontier defense concept, and he's answering the Catholic bishops for the nuclear freeze. You're making a terrible mistake. Well, Mr. Graham was in the Defense Department at the time of the COINTEL program that wanted to unite the CIA, the FBI, and Defense Department into all one Gestapo instead of separate agencies, and he's telling them a whole page that you bishops are working hard on something you can't do. And also the Washington Times saying they have to divest themselves of the moral luxury of wanting a world without nuclear arms. Now the Wall Street Journal had a story, I'm just citing a few of these, in November. Now, in November 1982, Catholic bishops will redraft their statement on the morality of nuclear arms strategy. The Roman Catholic bishops are getting a scolding from Rome, and this is at the time in October when Vernon Walters, who was a representative of the Vatican, the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, the Opus Dei, ran to the Pope, what are we going to do with these bishops? And when the Secretary of the Navy's brother was going around the country as a propagandist to put down the bishops. You remember the story I wrote for the National Examiner about Grace being in the Vatican. Here's her first cousin as a propagandist pressuring the Pope. And another story, Time magazine, November 29th, The Bishops and the Bomb. A theology of peace challenges the nuclear strategy. And there's a photograph of Bernardine, and he is saying the issue is not simply political. The church must be a participant in protecting the world and its people from the specter of nuclear destruction. Now, Mr. Bernardine was elevated to cardinal, and that is a very important step of the Pope this last week, passing up Paul Marcinkus and elevate Mr. Bernardine. There aren't that many good things that happen in the world. You have to go at length to explain them and understand them because there's so many pessimists that think we never can have change. Everything is going from bad to worse. An interesting thing is that something bad has to happen to make a change for the better. It is never made voluntarily. We attended a conference here at Asilomar about 22 years ago on existentialism and Zen, and Rollo May, the well-known psychiatrist, was here, and he was explaining that there's only two ways to change your life, really, or to change any major, it has to do with countries or people. One is to have 40 years of analysis, which countries never do, even though the CIA has done 30 years analysis of the Soviet Union and realized that they're not bankrupt. So I take that back. There are ways to analyze the situation, or one shock. And when Roberta Calvi, the banker for Banco Ambrosiano and for the Vatican money, was hung in London, it forced a whole lot of major changes and investigations. And out of that came a response and awareness of people in Europe when their money was tied up. They had to have new alternate ways of behaving. And even the Vatican was brought into the scandal, into the debts that Calvi had. He was murdered because of the debts, because of the Opus Dei. Then the Pope has to reevaluate. And all of a sudden, the Pope is sitting with Marcinkus, who can't leave the Vatican. And even he has to evaluate. I've got crook Marcinkus. I've had him on my lap. I've been Pope for X amount of years now. And before him, Pope Paul VI had him, and these various scandals and books coming out, these exposés, the book on the Vatican connection, the movie on the Vatican, it's all the Monsignor, it's all coming around him, and he's getting sunk in the quagmire, not only his past at Auschwitz, but his current corruption and the money corruption. So even he has to reevaluate who's running the world and who's crazy, and even the Pope has to say, Marcinkus, I can't push you up to one higher place. I guess the good Lord will have to give him a slide scale on down to you-know-where when it's all over. But Bernardine is promoted, and Bernardine is the man speaking against the weapons. And also that is an insult to the United States, to the CIA, to Mr. Pipes and Rostow and Mr. John Lehman, and to the powers that be that are pushing the nuclear weapons. It is a slap in their face to elevate a man who doesn't go with their weapons. And when they began to listen to Mr. Bernardine and the bishops began talking about the weapons, there was a long story in the Los Angeles Times that I saved. It's titled, Washington Remains Diplomatically Aloof from the Vatican. We were so cozy, remember, during the Solidarity years, during the pushing of the labor unions, but when the money dried up, when the Vatican money went to Lech Walesa, when the Western banks, the Chase Manhattan, the Citicorp, the Morgan, and the large banks began to pile these huge debts that can't be paid back, the connections of us with our allies began to sever. So as of October, U.S. Vatican ties cordial, but that's all. This article in Los Angeles Times by Don Shank, S-C-H-A-N-C-H-E. Washington remains diplomatically aloof. It says, today, America's diplomatic relations with the Vatican are no longer so close. In fact, the United States stays as far away from the Vatican as it can. The story says relationships are friendly, as witnessed by President and Mrs. Reagan's Vatican visit in June. That's when Ronald Reagan fell asleep while the Pope was talking in that room. The main point that I do want to bring up is that when the Vatican begins to talk about anti-nuclear weapons and gets a political idea of their own, the bishops and so forth, and meddles in the affairs of other countries that is opposed to what the United States wants, then we have stories that we are diplomatically aloof and apart from them. There was another interesting story this last September from the Vatican. The Vatican compares the U.S. sperm banks to Nazis. The California genius-level sperm bank that hopes to create a race of superhuman men has been the target of an attack by the official Vatican newspaper. The paper says that those sperm banks that attempt to breed geniuses by artificial insemination are openly racist and reminiscent of the Nazi experiment to create supermen and superwomen. Infanticide, eugenic abortions, the practice of alchemists, magicians, charlatans, the Nazi experiments are historic and cultural precedents, said L'Osservatore Romano, the newspaper from the Vatican. The Vatican opposes this, and they mentioned the American millionaire complex, the apparent reference to the California bank established by Robert K. Graham to collect the sperm of Nobel Prize winners and super bright scientists. So in last September the 30th in the fall, they were opposing the policies that we're doing here in California. Well, the time moves so quickly that I thought I would have time on this program to get into the Village Voice article, but I will begin next week and go right into that. In essence, what I might say as we finish off this broadcast in time, that when I published that article in the National Examiner that Princess Grace could have been murdered because of her trips to the Vatican this summer at a time when primary people in the Vatican were being killed, and the National Examiner didn't print them, Alexander Cockburn, Cockburn, I always call him Cockburn, but it's really Cockburn. He had an article in the Village Voice making fun of the stories about Grace Kelly, November 30th, 1982. Why Grace had to die, and he made fun of the National Enquirer, the National Globe, the Star, and the fight that the Kelly family had with the Prince of Monaco, that they thought Grace was murdered, and there was enough evidence of a cover-up and a scandalous story. Then he says on November the 2nd, the Grace saga reached a peak of inventiveness with the National Examiner headline, Why Grace Was Murdered. The thrilling narrative by Cliff Leindecker told how Grace, in the course of a visit to the Vatican, stumbled upon details, perhaps a spy had sought them out, of the Vatican international banking scandal. She had paid the price for her inquisitiveness. There was a wealth of interesting circumstantial detail, but at that point I noticed that the Examiner's story was based on theories of our old friend and assassination buff, Mae Brussell. I was pleased to see that Grace had fallen in the clutches of this grand mistress of conspiracy theory, but I felt no need to read further. And then he says, now the story is dying, and they've gone on to Liberace. The Princess Grace story isn't dying, and Alexander Cockburn does not call Mae Brussell and say, hey, this sounds interesting. Why do you make the allegations? He has made a habit of putting me down, and I can explain why I don't have time on this tape. Next week, we will continue right on with this subject, the role of propaganda in the United States, where it's coming from, how it's trying to push that World War III, the opposing forces that are surfacing, the role of the Vatican, and finally, men like Alexander Cockburn coming out with a story that is magnificent, with information that is of value to everybody. It should be in every paper in the United States. Maybe we could make copies and send them to editors around the country. If you want a copy, send a self-addressed stamped envelope, and I'll get it to you. In the meanwhile, we'll have to leave off at this point. I hate to do it, but the hour is up. This is Mae Brussell in Pacific Grove, California, and I'll be back with you next week.